That was quite wonderful way to gather as community to experience Hallel, the celebration of Psalms. The Book of Psalms, which is the foundation of so much of our Jewish prayer, like Hallel, is contained in the Book of Ketuvim, the latter writings, which is a big chest of various kinds of writings. We take out from that chest of Ketuvim, which means writings, on each of the major pilgrimage holidays, those 3 holidays, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot. So on Pesach, we read Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, tributed traditionally to King Solomon when he was a young man, a song of unrequited love, which the rabbis say is chosen for Pesach, a spring holiday, time of renewal, a time of love, but also linked to Passover as God yearning for the people of Israel and bringing them to God as part of that liberation. For Shavuot, the holiday of Matan Torah, the giving of Torah, we read from the book of Ruth in Ketuvim, the story of a Moabite woman married to an Israelite who chooses after her husband, 2 of her husbands die, chooses to, after her husband dies, one husband, chooses to follow her mother-in-law, Ruth, to join the people of Israel. So with the help of Luis, I will have a stand. In fact, I make a comment as I take this stand. This stand was donated by my mother, and I make mention of it because my mom is on my mind in that in the coming 10 days, she will have turned 100. So October 20th is very much on my mind. Back to the 3 Megillot. The Megillah that gets chanted on Sukkot is the Book of Kohelet. And Kohelet is the story of, here too, attributed traditionally to King Solomon. The rabbis will say that when he was young, King Solomon, he wrote that Song of Songs of unrequited love. In his middle years, proverbs, aphorisms of wisdom. But in his later years, he wrote the Book of Kohelet. That's the traditional description, though not necessarily the historical reality. The Book of Kohelet has this quality of appreciating the limitations of life. There is a darkness to the Book of Kohelet. Vanity, vanity, havel havalim, all is vanity. I'm going to read in honor of this, the last day of Sukkot. It's also Shemini Atzeret, but the 8th day of Sukkot. And traditionally, this is the day we read from the Book of Kohelet. But I will do that. It's often done before the Torah reading. But I want to acknowledge in this teaching moment what our Torah reading would have been if we were doing Torah readings. We would have read from the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 14 and 15, that describe the pilgrimage holidays, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot, and the additional holiday of Shemini Atzeret, which comes at the very end of Sukkot as a separate holiday. Today is also a day of Yizkor, and I will mention the reading in honor of Yizkor a little bit later. Would be a second Torah reading, which would be the offerings of Shemini Atzeret, and then the Haftorah would be today from the book of Malachim, the book of Kings. But as I noted, today is the day we would read from Kohelet, Kohelet is 12 chapters long, and I'm not going to read all 12 chapters, but I continue to be drawn to the work of Eddie Feld, Rabbi Feld, and his committee in putting together the book that we use, the Leeav Shalem, relatively new. And I want to pause and say this particular book was donated by Joe and Barbara Boehm, and it would be their wedding anniversary. And so I acknowledge and thank them. I bring Barbara and Joe Boehm to mind. The Book of Kohelet is 12 chapters, and in our Leeav Shalem, there is an edited version that I reread, and I thought that would be worthy of our time, to hear the words of Kohelet edited, which begins as follows. Divrei Kohelet ben David melech b'Yerushalayim. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, havel havalim, said Kohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a person in all the gains one makes beneath the sun? One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. Southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning blows the wind. On its round, the wind returns. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. All such things are wearisome. No one can ever state them. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear enough of hearing. Only that shall happen which has happened. Only that shall occur that has occurred. There is nothing new beneath the sun. Sometimes there is a phenomenon of which they say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since, in ages that went by before us. The early ones are not remembered. So too, those that will occur later will no more be remembered than those that will occur at the very end. Chapter 3. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uproot the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. Chapter 9. Go, eat your bread in gladness and drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes always be freshly washed, and let your head never lack anointment. Enjoy happiness with a person you love all the fleeting days of life that have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days, for that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. Whatever is in your power to do, do with all your might. For there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol, in the grave where you are going. I have further observed under the sun that the race is not won by the swift, nor the battle by the valiant, nor is bread won by the wise, nor wealth by the intelligent, nor favor by the learned. For the time of mischance comes to all, and one cannot even know one's time. As fishes are enmeshed in a fatal net, and as birds are trapped in a snare, so one is caught at the time of calamity when it comes upon you without warning. This too I observed under the sun about wisdom, and it affected me profoundly. There was a little city with a few people in it, and to it came a great king who invested it and built many siege works against it. Present in the city was a poor wise man who might have saved it, for he had wisdom. But nobody thought of that poor man, so I observed. Wisdom is better than valor, but a poor man's wisdom is scorned, and his words are not heeded. Words spoken softly by the wise are heeded sooner than those shouted by a lord in folly. Wisdom is more valuable than weapons of war, but a single error destroys much of value. And now the concluding words, chapter 12. A further word. Against them, my child, be warned. The making of many books is without limit, and much study is wearing of the flesh. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe God's commandments. For this applies to all humanity, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. Sof devar hakol nishma et Elohim yirah, et mitzvotav shmor, ki zeh kol ha'adam. Revere God and observe God's expectations, for this applies to the whole of humanity. The teachings of Kohelet, I invite you to consider opening up the book. There is more to the writing of Kohelet. And as a segue to Yizkor, I'd like to share a reading of an Israeli poet. One of my favorites, Yehuda Amichai, in that, interestingly, in this case, this selection of the poet Yehuda Amichai is in Yizkor, but it's in reference to Kohelet. And so as we prepare to remember our loved ones, who, as the author of Kohelet acknowledges, come and go, as do all our lives, we nonetheless appreciate that there is immortality. There is the opportunity to remember our loved ones, and in that regard, their presence endures. Yehuda Amichai. A man doesn't have time. A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest. What history takes years and years to do? A man doesn't have time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins to forget. And his soul is seasoned. His soul is very professional. Only his body remains forever an amateur. It tries and it misses, gets muddled, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and in its pains. A person will die as figs die in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet, the leaves growing dry on the ground. the bare branches already pointing to the place where there's time for everything.